sometimes there can even be feedback. So if you can do that, that would be great. As you know, we have a resolution that's coming before us here in another couple of hours at our business session. It's been an interesting time in our country and in our world with COVID-19, of course, but then particularly in the last several weeks now with the issue of racial justice and systemic injustice coming front and center, particularly most recently here in response to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and here within the geography of our own conference, Breonna Taylor. And so I am going to ask to get us started, Izzy Harbin, from whose church the resolution came, to tell us a bit about what prompted them to do that, what prompted her to lead in that, and to kind of give us an overview of the resolution. Izzy?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am Izzy Harbin, and I am the pastor at First Congregational Church in Elkhart, Indiana. If you can tell just a little bit by my accent, I am not from Indiana. I am from the South. I was raised in South Georgia in Valdosta, and I am a product of the desegregation movement. In 1972, the court ordered Valdosta, Georgia to desegregate their schools, and I was slap dab in the middle of all of that as an elementary school child. And the interesting thing about growing up in the South is that you learn very quickly some of the subtle things about race that as adults, we just sort of have forgotten, perhaps. One of the first things that I learned is that those people, and I use that very literally, those people live on the south side of town on the other side of the tracks. That was probably the first thing that I learned. Fortunately, I grew up in a family, though, that encouraged me to see people for exactly who they are. I did have this moment, though, when I was a senior in high school that completely reshaped how I think about race and race relations. A friend of mine, Roxanne, and I were riding the dirt roads, as you do in the South, for kicks and giggles. And we were on a road that we had never been on before. And in the South, we have tons of groves, huge groves of oak trees and pecan trees, often that are heavy laden with moss. And so we were coming up on this grove of oak trees, and we thought, wow, look at all that moss over there. And I pulled over and realized that it wasn't moss. It was actually old tattered rope still hanging from the tree. And Roxanne and I looked at each other speechless. We had studied about Southern history. We knew about lynchings. We knew about the culture of the area that we were riding in. But that moment became so real for me. I had lots of Black friends in high school. I played basketball with girls who told me from the get-go, if you don't know how to dance, you can't play ball with us. And I had to show them that I knew how to dance. We were thick. We were tight. I love those girls to this day. And to see what's happening in our country and to see the conversations that we have failed to have for too long, it breaks my heart. Brene Brown, who is a hero of mine, in her video, A Call to Courage, said something so profound, and this was probably the final straw for me in the impetus to write this. coupled with all of my childhood experiences, she said, we cannot expect those who live in the margins to be the ones to build the table and to set the table and to keep inviting us to the table, knowing that we're the ones who built this systemic system that holds and oppresses people. We have to be the ones to build the table, set the table, and invite people to come and show them that we want to be the very best allies that we can be. And so this is my effort to build a table, to set a table, and to proclaim that I want to be, my church wants to be the very best ally that we can be in tearing down systemic and structural racism. The other main point that I'd like to make is I believe that before you can spread a message far and wide, you have to clean your own house. And so for me, the church is my house. It's where I live and do most of my work. And so I think that this is where we need to start, with the own structural racism that we have within the United Church of Christ, in the Indiana-Kentucky Conference, within my church right here in Elkhart, Indiana. And that by studying all of the systemic ways that we have made the playing field so unlevel, and the ways that we've been unequal in how we do things in our conference. We need to study it. We need to understand it. We need to talk about it unashamedly. We need to talk about it. We need to own it, admit, repent, and do all the things that we can to tear down those structures so that we can build a more equitable world for all of our sisters and all of our brothers who are in this fight. And so that's where all this comes for me. I absolutely believe that Black Lives Matter, and we need to proclaim that every opportunity that we get. And we need to know that this resolution is really just a beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Izzy. Something else that occurred to me that I didn't touch on before we got going was that after we've heard from our panelists, we will open up for questions and discussion. You can type those into the chat box, or you may at the bottom of your screen see where you can raise a hand. If not, if you'll click where it says participants, then at the bottom of that list, it will give you an option to raise your hand. When we start responding to those, we will try to do so as best we can in the order in which they're offered. We covet your grace for problems that we may have along the way, but we will do our best. Let's go now to just hearing from a couple of other people from across the conference in terms of their reaction to what's going on in our world, but also to the resolution that's being offered. I'm going to start with John Jackson. John, would you share with us?
Thank each and every one of you from the Indiana-Kentucky Conference, and this time of reflection and reorganizing to address racism. I really appreciate Izzy and the First Congregational Church for the resolution. And let me just say why I appreciate that. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 said in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. In mathematics, if you don't solve a problem, you still have a problem. So the problem of the 21st century, problem of the color line. Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III, who is the senior pastor of the Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, crafted a letter to white evangelicals that I want to extrapolate from right now. In the letter, he gave an example of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who attended a Bible Society convention in a southern state. And he said the room that they were in, there was a window that opened up to a slave market. And so on the one hand, Ralph Waldo Emerson stated that they could hear the glad tidings of the good news, but then they also could hear the regaling of an auctioneer saying, going, going, gone, as another Black body was being sold. What was shocking and downright hypocritical was that no one in that Bible convention, after hearing about Moses and the struggle of Israelite Hebrew people to come out from under the bondage in Egypt, after studying Amos and even studying Jesus, no one went out of that room to stand on that ground and say, stop it, let my people go. And so I extrapolate from his letter to say that I'm glad to see the resolution, and then I'm really excited to see the work that's going to come from the resolution. I said revolution. That's going to come from it, that the Indiana-Kentucky Conference can be instrumental in leading. Because from the letter that Dr. Haynes wrote, we need white allies, white churches. And the letter was to white evangelicals who are supporting a horrendous hypocrisy in the White House. Mm-hmm. And the letter points out, white people created racism. It's important then that white churches, white evangelicals use these platforms to cancel racism. It's important to show up and speak up in the places, at the scenes of racist behavior. I was glad to see that video of the Agape gathering where folk, Black, white, gay, straight, all kind of people came together to address the despicable murder of Breonna Taylor, and that her killers have not been addressed. It is unconscionable to be a follower of Jesus Christ and not, first of all, feel something, but then be moved to do something. And so we got a lot of work to do, and it's important. Again, I appreciate white churches joining in this struggle and helping to lead it, because again, this is the issue that was created, white superiority, white supremacy, and white hate. Finally, when I say got a lot of work coming up, there are subtle and not so subtle messages being sent out from the White House right now. To have a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one of the most wicked things that could be done, because it's sending a message like Ronald Reagan did in 1980 when he went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to announce his running for the presidency. And he was saying to a group of people that I got your back and it's okay. And now the next, the Republican convention is going to be in Jacksonville, Florida. the site of the Axe Handle Massacre. 200 white men went and beat the hell out of sit-in protesters. And when the black folk went to the police to say, would you do something about it? The police arrested the black people who were sitting in. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm glad that we have some strong allies in the Indiana-Kentucky Conference, because this COVID-19 has not only caused this havoc that has gripped the planet, but it's also pulled the covers off of some deep inequalities and systemic inequality that has been going on for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So much in what you said, but a point that I take from it that I think needs to really be made is that this resolution is not an end of itself. It's a beginning. There's work to be done. Too many denominations and churches and groups over the last 30, 40 years have passed resolutions apologizing for past actions, apologizing for racism, but then not done anything to truly change or to repair the damage done. You know, we are mindful that this resolution calls for action. And if we don't act, it's just empty words. So thank you, John. Lakota Iron Rope, what would you share with us now?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I would also like to start off just with a Bible verse that has kind of been leading me through this weird time in our country. It's John chapter 15, verses 12 through 13. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The reason I have been kind of clinging to that verse recently is because I've been asking myself in various ways, what can I do to support my Black brothers and sisters? I am a proud Oglala Sioux woman. I'm gonna try not to get too emotional here, guys. I'm married to a white man, and until we started dating, he was one of those people that didn't really see that we still have a problem. And it was when we started dating that people would start to give us weird looks when we would go out to the grocery store, or we're taking a walk downtown, anything like that. He started to notice people were staring at us and kind of seeing us differently. And at one point he brought it up to me and he was like, you know, like people stare at us and sometimes give us dirty looks. And I had to kind of take a sigh of relief and be like, thank God you noticed. That just means that your eyes are opening to the world that people of color have to live in nowadays. But it also puts it into perspective for me, and knowing that, I know this sounds really weird to say, but I'm not that brown. And so it puts it into perspective of how Black men and women and children are treated on a day-to-day basis in ways that we can never understand, in a way that I can't understand because I can pass as white to some people. And so it kind of made me realize that even though my husband's a wonderful person and has, you know, no latent racism in his heart, we all have this implicit racism that we were raised with. that we were taught as children growing up. And so I wanted to do what I could to help lift and support Black voices and Black organizers in my community. And so one thing that I have been doing is I joined a medic group where we supply our town's protesters with water, snacks, medical supplies. If they need a Band-Aid, we've got the Band-Aid. If they need ice, we've got the ice. We try to find these little ways where we can support the Black organizers and support the protesters without taking the mic, if that makes sense. And that's just one small way that I'm working to help lift the Black voices in my community. With this resolution, we are committing to start making a change in our hearts, in our minds, in our churches, in our communities. Sorry. This is just the first step. And one thing that I want us to consider when we are having conversations about this resolution is to think of this as a commitment to action. I fear, and this is just my own fears coming out here, I fear that if we do not make the commitment to action and not just voting for this resolution as a, yep, I voted for that, if we don't commit to the actual action and commitment to working on hearts in our own churches, in our own communities, that this will be another broken promise to our Black community. And if you know, the American government hasn't always been great at keeping promises to Indigenous communities either. So I want to urge you to read over this resolution, think about it, open your heart, open your mind, and don't just make the commitment to vote for this resolution. I want you to make the commitment to bring this home, work on the hearts and minds at your church and in yourself and within your family, and have the hard conversations. We are the church, and we are supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And I can't help but think of the song by Casting Crowns, if we are the body, why aren't his arms reaching? Why aren't his hands healing? And I would like for us to start with ourselves and with this resolution and make that commitment to be the body of Christ, to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and to show that we are Christians by our love. Thank you.
Thanks, Lakota. And by the way, never apologize for emotion. It's powerful. Thank you. Before we get to questions, Izzy, can I come back to you and just let you kind of speak more specifically to what actions the resolution calls for, what it's going to call upon us to do in the coming weeks and months?
Absolutely. So I've got my handy dandy iPhone set up here so I could actually see the resolution. When we get to the therefore be it resolved piece, there are several very specific things that I'm asking us to really consider. The first thing is that we need to provide opportunities for our associations and all those committees within our associations and all the member churches to examine our own explicit and implicit racism and the institutional structures of racism that pervade our churches from living in a racist culture. All right, and many of you know that that I've been in recovery for like 1,000 years, and I really love a 12-step program because step 4 tells us that we need to take a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, and really that's what I'm asking us to do. I'm asking every church to be bold enough to look inside and say, wow, how have we kept these structures and these systems in place? What have we done? And really examine. All right. The second thing is that we want to create a task force called our own Justice and Witness Ministries Task Force for the Indiana-Kentucky Conference. And that we want at least one, I'm hoping more will sign up, but I understand restraints on time and energy, but at least one person from every association to come together for the purpose of studying the structural and systemic racism that pervades our communities and our churches specifically, to look at all of the ways in which we consciously or unconsciously have engaged in racism. And then I give you a good definition for that, what systemic racism is all about. And then the next thing is that this Justice and Witness Task Force will put together an action plan. Now that action plan will be a collective document, hopefully, from all the work done over the next year, from all the churches and all of the associations and all of the committees that have been doing this work all year long, that says these are the things that we're going to commit to. And that action plan is then going to go to the board of directors, and the board of directors is going to sign off on the action plan and say, yes, we are ready. And then we will make our next big focus at the 58th annual meeting to look at the work that this committee did, the work that we did in our churches and in our associations. We're going to plan some really important activities that will further illustrate white privilege and the ways in which we lean into white privilege that we may not even be aware of, to continue the work, because again, this is just a beginning. This is just starting the conversation. I believe that in order to do the work, we have to understand what that work is, and that's why I think we need this time to do the research. We need the time to have the conversations. We need time for people to assess their own communities and their own churches and what they have done and what they haven't done. And probably most important, and I didn't put this in the resolution, but I hope people are smart enough to figure this out, for our African American churches, we are hoping, and I am praying, that you will guide us in some ways to see things that we don't already see or can't see. And that you will be bold enough at my invitation now to say, no, you're headed in the wrong direction, or no, you're missing the point. Because we have been so blinded by how we have been acculturated that we need to be schooled. And we can talk about how woke we are, but the truth is we are not woke, and we need to be woke. And so now is the time to begin those conversations, and to know that when we sit down, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to say the wrong things. We're going to do the wrong things. We're going to get our behinds handed to us. And I'm going to tell you, though, the worst thing that we could do is to say, because of that, I don't want to have the conversation. I'm telling you, that's the very definition of privilege. We must have the conversations. We don't have an option anymore. And so we have to start somewhere. And so my hope is that through education, through collaboration, and through this action plan, and Lakota, you nailed it. If we don't do any action steps, it doesn't do any good. Like nothing. We're not going to achieve anything because we've been talking about this for how long, right? I mean, this is the beginning part of the whereas, the whereas, the whereas. I mean, from the moment we started, we said we were a uniting and united church, right? And we've been talking at least since 1993 about how we want to be multiracial and multicultural. And yet, still, 11 a.m. Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. And we're in 2020. So some got to change. And it's, if we can't do it now, I don't know when. I mean, I can't even imagine what this world will look like if we keep going in the direction that we're going. So I appreciate this opportunity to share with you. And you know, if you have any questions specifically about the resolution or any questions about our motivations or anything like that, we're open to answering any and all. Thank you.
Thanks, Izzy. And I really appreciate what you said as far as how much we need our Black sisters and brothers and siblings to help us remove the scales from our eyes. We need to do the work, us white folks. But you are so right in that we are blind in ways of which we are unaware. And we need to just humbly ask for that help. Okay, we are a little over half an hour into our time. We've got a half an hour or so left. Does anyone have a question or a point to bring up for any of our panelists? Okay. See, we've got a couple of raised hands, and I'm not sure as far as who was first, but I'm gonna think Timothy.
Great, thank you. Timothy Murphy, Senior Pastor at Plymouth Congregational Church, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Having reviewed the resolution, what I see here is a pretty helpful framing around, there's different ways to look at racism and address it. One is the awareness raising, which we've, have those, book studies and stuff for years. One is the racial justice solidarity work around policy change, activism. But what I see especially emphasized in the resolution is the work of looking at where is racism institutionally still operating in our congregations, association, and conference, and that work is builds upon the decades of work around raising awareness on white privilege, reading the new Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. And I really think this can be a helpful thing because it's a next step for churches saying, okay, we want to be anti-racist. Racism still infects our white institutions. How do we start to clear out this gunk? And that this, if we approve this and have this task force formed, I believe it could help give us some resources so that congregations can actually say, here are often places where racism perpetuates itself in our congregations and how we can start to clear that stuff out. And so I'm excited about this, particularly emphasizing the be it resolved and so forth, because I think it's looking at the right thing, and it's a complement to the larger societal racial justice work, of which this resolution is really kind of separate from that, but both are needed. And that's just really my comment.
Thank you, Timothy. Any comment from our panelists on Timothy's statements? Thank you. Okay. TJ Jenny, what did you have for us?
I'd like to come back to something that Izzy said that I think is really important, and that is that the church needs to look at itself first. I mean, along with society, but she said, and it's true, it's been said many times, that it's still the case that Sunday at 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour during the week. And honestly, we keep making excuses for that, and we ought not to. I think every church should look and say, what do we need to be more inviting, and frankly, make our worship services more inspiring to people of color. And frankly, I think that the Black church has done a better job with being closer to contemporary church. When you sort of look at the big contemporary churches, the music is more lively. I think a lot of us are hopelessly lost in the 50s and very stiff and stilted worship. And I think there's a lot to be said to taking a step away from, if I may say, unfortunately, stereotypically, sort of the white worship that's stilted, and I just don't think it's helpful. We have the Black Voices of Inspiration come once a year, if at all possible, to Emmanuel. We're fortunate to have them in town, but I don't think you can just sort of pay lip service to society and making changes without looking at the church and saying, what are we doing about our worship service? What are we doing about our programming for being more invitational and being more collaborative with across the range from our Black community and the Latino community, the Asian community? What do we need to do to start looking like what we need to look like in our own church services Sunday morning, as well as the fellowship hour throughout the week?
Thanks, TJ. Any thoughts from our panelists in response to TJ's points?
Yeah, let me just add to PJ's point. Think about, well, as we talk about, the church. Black Lives Matter didn't start in the church. Black Lives Matter started outside of the church because the church takes too long to wake up and get engaged. And so that, in many ways, that's when we say the church, that's Black and white churches. Unfortunately, we have tended to have too high of a heavenly minded gospel rather than a gospel that speaks to where people are. I say often in my church that this gospel is not pie in the sky, by and by when you die, but it is something sound by the pound on the ground while you are still around. And we've been lamenting about, church attendance and feeling like the church is dying, when what attracts people is what you are doing outside of the walls. And so I have to re-emphasize this in my congregation, that what makes a difference is being like Jesus and doing the work outside of the walls, where people live and what they are dealing with. And that makes you attractive. Music is, you got to have music. You want lively music? Yes. But what really attracts folk is that you're actually putting yourself, putting something on the line to address the inequality, because it's so pervasive now. Martin King said so long ago that the three demons that wreak havoc in America: militarism, materialism, and racism. And so these are things that people are struggling with. And so as we look for this task force and all that, we got to look at policing and defunding policing, because they've been highly militarized and Black communities are over-policed and underserved. And there's a reason for that. And we got to look and be honest about those reasons. We got to look at medical apartheid. COVID-19 has really shown, why is it that Black and brown people are more adversely affected by COVID-19, which is no respecter of persons? It's because Black and brown people tend to be on that part of the scale where they can't go to regular doctor's appointments to address preventable things. And so this has exacerbated it. We got to deal with food and job insecurity in poor neighborhoods, in particular Black and brown community. We've got to deal with voter suppression that you see going on right now. How you gonna limit that you have 200 voting places, you're gonna limit it to 10? No, you're sending a message because you're putting weight on the scale, and we got to address those things. But then look at Indiana. We can really start here and just go back and see what happened to Gary when Mayor Richard Gordon Hatchett was elected. What happened in the aftermath of that? What happened in the state legislature to cut off the city and create legislation that only affected one city, that had the nerve to say that Black people have enough intellect to govern budgets and things like that? What happened? How do you get Maryville? How do you get? We can look at those things and say there's some horrendous wrong that have been done. And guess what? Black Lives Matter has showed us when you do that, you get people from all spectrums, from all areas who want to come and be a part of that, because you're doing something that's affecting their lives, the least of these, that starts from the bottom up, not top down.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Sarah Lund, I think you're next up.
Thank you so much to our panelists for your testimonies, your insights, and your faithful courage. One question I have in terms of action items, and I know in the chat people are asking, what about concrete steps we can take? The Southeast Association is going to be looking at a resolution to require anti-racism training for all authorized clergy in the Southeast Association. And we have our annual meeting coming up in August. But I'm wondering what this group thinks about amending this current resolution to include in the whereas that this task force will look at creating mandatory anti-racism training for all authorized clergy in the IKC. Because if our clergy aren't trained in this, then how can our congregations get trained? And our theological institutions are not doing this training. So I just open up that option for conversation.
Sarah, I'm going to jump in. Thank you for that. And absolutely, when what I think would be the most effective and easy way to do that is when the amendment is proposed, or when the resolution is proposed a little bit later, that an amendment be offered to add that, and then we vote on the resolution as amended. Because I think that all clergy need anti-racism training, absolutely. And that certainly can be a part of what we do moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, Reverend Jackson, you mentioned a word when you were talking that I think is really critical for us to think about, and that word is lament. In the scriptural context of Lamentations, the people were called together as a body to lament. They were called together as a body to repent. And if I can be so bold to say that as a conference, we need to be lamenting and repenting. And that needs to be a part of the work that we do collectively. When I think about action, I think about actively repenting for the ways in which we have held tight to structural racism, systems of racism. We need to be clear as a body, as part of the body of Christ, that those behaviors cannot stand. And so my hope is at the next annual gathering, that there actually be a time for us to engage in public group, conference-wide lament and repent.
I'm so glad you said that, because for starting out with Black people in America, one of the things I've said is that Black people have not been allowed to lament and express rage and grief which is part of the healing process. When you look at what happened in Charleston, there is something in this society that pushes Black people to be forgiving, so forgiving first, that the rage, the anger, the frustration, too many people, in particular in the church, are uncomfortable with. And I think there are various reasons for that. But we got to be able to sit with that pain. Anybody that goes through grief, anybody that goes through trauma has to be allowed to go through it. And others, allies, are just to sit and lament and feel. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This knee was on this man's neck who was already handcuffed. He was already prostrate on the ground. He was not resisting. After 6 minutes, y'all, he lost consciousness. Yet the knee was still on his neck for almost another 3 minutes. And it's really a time to really weep, because it cleanses the spirit and soul. But you got to feel that. And for Black people in America, that is just one of thousands that have had to assault the psyche and the emotion. And so that, I'm glad you said that about the lamenting and weeping, that yes, it has to happen.
This
Thank you.
is Les Small Stokes. I saw earlier that somebody tried to unmute me because I raised my hand, and I don't know what the proper way to jump in is. Is this an okay time for me to jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay. I really appreciate what you're sharing about the impact of racism, and how those of us who are not experiencing the brunt of racism need to just sit in grief and mourning with folks. I think a huge part of this initiative, if we are going to do it well, has to include trauma-informed education, so that we as a whole conference know and can better respond to the long-term impacts of trauma on communities of people, on individual congregations, on our entire conference. The experience of racism and the experience of trauma go hand in hand. So I don't think we can do this well without also including trauma-informed care. Thank you.
Thanks, Les. I want to try to get to questions that are in the chat feed as well. And I think we've got quite a few in there, and I'm having a little difficulty just trying to find where the first one is. I know there was one about suggestions for resources, how to start in your local church. Would anyone like to respond to that?
Sure. The Indiana Kentucky Conference website has been building a fantastic resource platform for all kinds of materials, and there's stuff all over the internet. I would say start with a good TED Talk. That's a great way to spark a conversation. There are lots and lots of books right now available to read. I would recommend to anybody and everybody, if you haven't read James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that might be one of the best places to start, so that you really get an understanding of this intersection between racism and the church. And I think that there are other resources. We've been talking a lot about white privilege, and there's some great research out there on white privilege and having those kinds of conversations. So yeah, I would start at the IKC website and go, and then just build your own resource platform as well.
If I can add, also, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference is a very good resource. It is an ecumenical social justice conference of pastors and laypersons whose sole responsibility is to address inequality. And there are a wealth of resources and allies to be gained from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference.
Thanks, John. Jill, why don't you go ahead and jump in? Did you have a question?
No, actually, I wanted to offer a response to a number of the questions that I'm seeing show up in the chat, particularly about ensuring that we can move to actual action and not just basically take a vote, feel happy about that, and maybe talk a little bit. So for those of you who are don't follow such things, one of the individuals on this panel discussion, Reverend John Jackson, is currently a member of the board of directors. And John is on the slate to be nominated for yet another 2-year term on the board. And so if that passes, we will have John on that board and we will have his voice. We are also putting the Reverend Jamesetta Ferguson on the slate. And she would be another voice from a person of color that we would have sitting on our board to be able to help inform us and move us to action and to ensure that we don't just sit there and feel good about having had a vote. We also have the Reverend Izzy Harbin on our slate to become the treasurer for the next board of directors. So as one of the authors of this resolution, we would have her there. In addition, I know that not just a number of the members of our board, but our conference minister are beyond supportive of this resolution. And I serve as your current chair of the board. It's up to the next board as to whether or not I would continue to serve in that. But as long as I am a member of this board, you would have my commitment that we would hold ourselves accountable to ensuring we get a plan that will result in action. What we will not be able to do is to be accountable for how the individual hearts of all of our members and our clergy truly change. I do want to note that this work will look and feel hard. It will look and feel messy. Different people, different congregations will move at different rates. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage and shouldn't continue to push forward. So hopefully that addresses a few of the questions, at least about what would be next and how we might ensure that we continue to actually take action. And I would suggest that if you see that we're not doing that, you can hold your board accountable the next time we've got a slate of people to be elected. Thank you.
And I would add, there is action that needs to be taken and work that has got to get done. That being said, it was in 1619 that the first kidnapped Africans were brought to the shores of what is now the United States. So we've got over 400 years in which this system has been built to favor those of us with white skin and to systemically oppress and negatively impact the lives of those with black skin. We're not going to be able to fix it overnight, but that does not absolve us of the responsibility to work at it and to do all that is ours to do, and that we have the time in our lifetime to do. So I see a question from John Gant, as the task force is put together to help examine and attack implicit and explicit racism in our congregations and conference structures, how do we make sure the task force is positioned to listen and to be advised by persons of color who can help us see what we have not seen all these years? I think you pretty well addressed that, Jill. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has anything to add to that.
Dale.
Yes.
Merlin Lawrence has been waiting to speak.
I'm sorry.
Merlin Lawrence.
Okay. I did not see that hand. So
I'm going to spotlight him now.
Okay.
Sorry. Her.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak. I've been trying to get in for so long. I serve a church here in Highland, Indiana, close to Gary, and in Northwest Indiana. And it's a predominantly white church. It's amazing that they did call me a person of color to the church. I've been there 2 years and basically had to build up trust. 2 weeks ago, and I preached about these issues, racism and all the isms over my time there. But 2 weeks ago, during this time of pandemic and protest, I preached about what was happening with the protests and so forth. And I had such a response. Well, from one person who actually said he was speaking for other people in the congregation, that they wanted to hear positive sermons and lift me up sermons, and they didn't want to hear about this. And the person was very, very angry. And so that is a challenge that we face in our congregations. Our white congregations don't want to hear about this. And it is very hard. I come from South Africa. I grew up under apartheid. We worked to bring apartheid to its knees through grassroots community organizing. So I know very closely this issue. And it's actually a very painful issue to talk about because racism is rife here in America. And so that is just something that I guess the task group would have to address. How do we, our pastors may be on board, but how do we get our churches on board? I think I have good relationships with my folks, but when this issue came up, it was like they were going to stone me. So it's just an issue that I would like maybe the task force to address.
So Merlin, one of the things that I'd like to share with you is that there were a number of us that went to Indianapolis for conflict resolution training. And it is my hope that the task force can work closely with this conflict resolution team that we have developed, because I think that some of the work that needs to be done within the congregations is going to require teams of people coming in to do some mediation work and conflict resolution around racism because it's so entrenched, and we do get that reaction, right? Oh, I'm tired of hearing about this. I don't want to hear about this, and it doesn't affect me, or it doesn't matter to me, or 1,000 reasons, but it does, and we have to be able to lay out the framework for people to understand how all of that scaffolding has been built and how we need to dismantle it. And so it is my hope that the work that the task force does in figuring out what some of these systemic systems are that are so entrenched in our churches, that they can work with that conflict resolution task force as well, or the mediation team, in order to help bring some of that down. And those of you that are in the room that participated in the mediation training, I'd love to hear what you think about that collaboration as well, and if you think that that would work.
Incidentally, Izzy, I've had that training as well through the Lombard Mennonite Center.
I wanted to throw in something real quick, just to consider. I think for many predominantly white churches, the members that struggle with this, Merlin, the ones that, have gotten angry with you, I would like to say that it comes from a place of fear, a fear of shame and guilt. I think many people with this Black Lives Matter movement in our country, they feel that it is to shame them for feeling like they're part of the problem. And even if they are, they feel it as an attack on them. And that's where that fear comes from. That's where that anger comes from. And I think we should somehow, and there's no easy solution to that fear and that guilt, but somehow come up with the language to start that conversation that, yes, we need to own our role in this society, in society's racism. We need to own our own role, but then also identify like we are capable of change and we are capable of being a part of the solution. And that saying that neutrality is the side of the oppressor. So we can no longer be neutral in situations of oppression. We have to be anti-racist. It's not enough to just be not racist anymore. I think that's a hard concept for a lot of white folk, and try and have the conversation of, no, you don't necessarily need to feel shame and guilt. We need to move past that point, and we need to start working together as a community and as a church to start changing some hearts and minds.
I think we have to also come to grips with that there are going to be people who, in our churches, who are just going to not get it, and they're going to leave. I was talking with a white pastor in our conference this week, and he pointed out when that he had a member who told him that you don't support the president, and I don't like it, and left the church. And so there's really no good way to nice it up. I'm not saying that you have to slap somebody in the face, but truth does that in itself. This Confederate flag issue is a horrendous disrespect of people, but there are some folk who have bought the lie. And so part of this is going through these little areas of telling the truth. And then you can't train somebody's heart not to be racist, but you can train them about behavior, racist behavior, and we're not going to be tolerated. But there's also challenging people to go back in your own family history and look at how your privilege has been at the expense of other people. I shared with Chad this documentary, The Uncomfortable Truth. Loki Mulholland, his mother was a freedom rider, white guy, mother was a freedom rider. And he openly admits in there that as progressive as he has been, there are these areas that run in him of supremacy that he has to constantly wrestle with. And he looks back at his family and how they were architects to this system. And he laments that. And yeah, there is some shame that, I've been a part of something like this. But the good thing is to come through that, become better, and we begin to, again, I keep saying, we got to feel this. You can't make folks feel it, but we got to find a way to change the narrative so that people can feel pain that Black folk have been feeling for so long. Thank you.
And I would add, Merlin, I've been in churches like that just want feel-good sermons. But what occurs to me is, and this may or may not be received by these folks, but expressing to them that simply having the freedom to not talk about it is privilege. Saying that it doesn't affect me, so I don't want to hear about it, that in itself is a position of privilege, because our Black siblings don't have that option. It affects them every day. So we are beginning to come toward the end of our time, and I know we're not going to get to everyone's question. I do see in the chat from Brenda Burney that you had something to say. Brenda?
Thank you, Dale, and thank you to the panel, which was wonderful. I actually kind of put it in my chat there after Merrill spoke, because I too had been in a white congregation as the first Black woman. There's a pastor. The church was said they were intentionally wanting to integrate, become a multiracial church, as we resolved in 1993. However, the one thing I found before they really was that and have the people come and they receive the people with compassion. It was more about assimilate as we are, rather than seek to understand how this other culture really does fit into our congregation, how we can blend together. And so that happened right here in our conference. And so I think that, yes, this is good that we are having this conversation. And yes, the responsibility does fall more on the white privileged people than it does on the Blacks or African American or other nationalities, people of color. And so I just wanted to share that I'm glad that we're having this conversation, but in addition to this conversation, as Lakota has already said, there needs to be that responsibility that we take action for, because with that responsibility, I think we need to have not only conversation, but corrective action in putting this covenant together. And so, it definitely was a hurtful time, and it's still, it impacts my ministry to today. So just thank you for allowing me to share, but thank the panel for taking the time, and Izzy, especially the energy to draft this resolution. So I don't know if it was a question or a statement or what I was saying, but again, thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. As I'm working my way down through the chat, I see a question from Rachel Small-Stokes about if maybe pastoral search committees and committees on ministry, if it should, if I'm reading her question right, if anti-racism training for those committees ought to be just an automatic thing, a matter of practice on how we do things, that those committees receive that training. Thoughts about that from Izzy or others on the panel?
Absolutely. Rachel, I think that part of the action plan certainly could be that anybody serving in any position and on any committee or within the association in any way has to go through anti-racism training and diversity, sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think we could build that into the action plan. And wouldn't it be amazing to see all of our committees on ministries, all of our associations doing the same thing for once on such an important issue, right? To say that we're going to train as many people. And of course, every time somebody cycles off and somebody new cycles on, you do more and more training. Eventually, you've trained everybody, hopefully. Wouldn't that be cool? You know, and so, yeah, I think we have to want to do better and be better.
I want to thank all of our panelists, and I certainly want to thank Dale Raines for being our, not just a superb moderator of this conversation, but also for architecting at twice this annual gathering. He helped put together the Planning Commission when we were going to be in person, and then they pivoted and helped put together our virtual, and then pivoted when the circumstances of both pandemics of white violence and the pandemic of disease have affected us all. So Dale, thanks to you, and thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of you as speakers. These are important matters. This is the church at work. This is how love moves. So I hope to see you all at 2 o'clock. We need to end this right now. You'll find a link to the if you're a delegate, you'll find a link to the 2 o'clock business meeting. If you'd like to watch the business meeting, it will be on the IKC YouTube channel. So you can watch it, the proceedings, if you'd like to see how some of these actions will be dealt with by the delegates as we move ahead. Thank you so much, and I apologize for cutting our conversation off. We have to move forward to do the work. Thank you.